Hey everybody, Malcolm here. I promised a recap video actually going over the games from the first Silicon Valley Open that I played in last week, and so I'm here to do that. The games are pretty long, and I actually had a lot of thoughts. It turns out when you play a chess game for 4 hours, you have a lot to say about the position, so I tried to distill it down to 3 moves per game. Alright, with that, let's jump in. Alright, so my first game I was playing against Parsa Bhaktari. Start out e4, e5, he plays a Petrov defense, and we go into a classical Spanish variation. Not a ton interesting happens until we get to about this point. So if I make a nothing move, right? In fact, it's his turn. So if I make a nothing move, he's going to move forward with his pawn here, and that traps my bishop. We're just guarding all of these squares. The bishop has no way to retreat, and if it takes here, it gets taken. So I have to prevent that somehow by my move. Now, the things I was thinking of were f3, h3, and eventually h4. So f3 I don't like. It absolutely pins my knight to my king, and that's going to make it difficult to make my knight useful later in the game, so I discard that. h3 seems okay, but I wasn't sure how to respond here. I can tuck my bishop in, but it seems like it's going to be stuck there for a very long time, and I'm going to have to move my king in order to get it out to a more useful diagonal. So I ended up discarding that idea in favor of playing what I played in the game, which is h4, and I felt like this was pretty smart. If my opponent takes, then I can just take back. I'm now pinning this knight along the diagonal, and if my opponent doesn't take and pushes forward, my bishop is relatively safe. I'm still guarding this pawn, and I still have activity over the diagonal that I already had. So I felt like this was good, and that is in fact how the game continued. h4, he plays knight g4, and we keep playing through. This position is actually already winning to some degree for me, and it's winning more and more as I attack along the queen side. He's pushed all these pawns, so it's not particularly useful for him. And the next critical moment of the game comes after we trade some pawns and I open up his queen side. We get to this point. So I played rook a6, not having realized that his previous move, bishop d7, bishop d7, is attacking this pawn. So he just takes the pawn, and I've blundered away the pawn advantage that I have. And so when you end up in this position, the smart thing to do is to just admit your mistake, just back up. And I saw that he took the pawn, I was disappointed, and I thought, it's okay, just back up, admit that you're wrong. You don't want to spiral out of control doing something crazy. So that was good, and that's what the computer said you should do. Either play rook back to a1 or rook to a2. So the critical part of the game actually only comes a couple of moves later. You can see that I'm lined up on this a file, and that's tough for him, and I don't want to trade. So I wait, I force him to do the trading, and he plays queen f5, and I line up this battery. And the thing that he noticed is I'd been playing along this a file the whole time, so he thinks, hey, I want to close this. And what he doesn't recognize, and I'll give you a moment to see if you recognize it, is when he plays knight a5, what was the other threat of playing queen a1? You'll notice that the evaluation bar jumps way up. It's to play what I played in the game, which is rook takes h8 all the way across the board. And as soon as I played that, he did the sound that everyone makes when they've made a big mistake, and I thought, okay, cool, I wasn't missing something. This was fine, and that's true. I did sit there for a minute and make sure that I wasn't missing something, like was I dropping my queen? Does knight a5 protect against some huge threat? It doesn't. Now, my opponent played proactively, and he managed to check me a few times and win the exchange back. But I was able to just invest in my h-pawn, keep moving, play resourcefully, and when he finally gets to this point, I defend the queenie square, which is going to put me another piece up, and it was at this point that my opponent resigned. So good first game. And I almost forgot, I wanted to show you guys the cap score, because people like that. So white played 90.9, my opponent played 80.8, and that makes sense. I managed to garner an advantage, but if we look at some of these positions, like, white has an advantage, but it's a little bit hard to realize or turn that into something real when you're a player sort of my caliber. But I was never in a position where I really had trouble, and I only had one blunder. There was only one point where I lost a significant advantage, and my opponent's blunder was much worse than mine, so this seems fair. All right, on to the second game against Aiden, the famous 9-year-old, and we're going to go ahead and flip the board here because I was playing black. And the first thing to note here is that when we get to this position here, I wasn't exactly sure what to do. It was clear to me that I could castle either way, but because my opponent moved their queen, they're not just planning on pushing this pawn down the board, I don't think, and even if they did, that wouldn't be particularly problematic for me because I'm defending the square twice. But it occurs to me that they're going to castle queenside, And I'm not sure that I'm going to castle queenside either. I could, but they already have these knights over here, and it's unclear to me whether or not castling on the same side there puts me in a reasonable spot, because my opponent has the 4-on-3 advantage on the king side. So I play h6, and this is what my opponent identified as a mistake, and I don't think it's a mistake outright. I think it only becomes a mistake when I play defensively later. But this is what Aiden said after the game. He was like, you shouldn't play h6. And I was like, okay, fair enough, Aiden, fair enough. So the next important point comes to when we get to this position. Now, when you're castled opposite sides, so I'm castled on the king side and he's castled on the queen side, somebody's going to lose. Like, there are very few positions like this that result in a reasonable draw that's not a perpetual check. Usually the game becomes exciting. And he's pushing all his pawns on the king side. So what I needed to do in this position is I need to play something like a6. I need to prepare to push along the queen side. And instead, what I did is I played defensively knight e7. And you can see the computer does not like this move. And this is the beginning of me curling into a ball. We're only on move 12, and already I'm feeling a lot of pressure. So this is not going well. I needed to play more confidently and more aggressively. We'll see that that bites me later in the tournament, but that was true in this position. So my opponent continues their onslaught. And it is at this point, when my opponent plays f4, you'll notice that because they have a pawn here, they're getting ready to fork my knight and my bishop. And I sit there and I see that, and I'm starting to realize that things aren't so good. So, do I back my bishop up, or how do I get my knight out? I can't really protect this square in a meaningful way. So I sit there and I think for a while. And as I think more and more about all the different possibilities I have, do I want to get my queen out here and try and get a queen trade? Like, what's the move here? Eventually, I forget that this is the threat. And so I play f6 thinking, oh, okay, I'll just back my bishop up, try and break up the g5 pawn here. And this is the point where Aiden just went, huh? And he pushes here, and you can see that he just has a dominating position. He's going to win material here, and I spend the next few moves just trying not to get checkmated. But this was not a strong showing by me. Checkmated in 24 moves. That is the definition of a miniature. And if we check out the caps report, we can see Aiden, 98.7, very familiar with the line. It is obvious that he is very good at this position. Me, 16.4, not good. Not good. So that was the drubbing that we saw earlier. But, credit to my opponent. He played well, and now I've learned something about this position. So next time I know I need to attack more. In fact, probably I'll just also castle queenside, and we can play a more positional game. Never play a kid tactically. Anyways, on to the next game. All right, so this was my Saturday evening game against Steven Berger, and again, I get to play white, which is nice. So we open in an Alpine Sicilian. Things are relatively uneventful. I actually don't think I get a particularly large advantage out of this opening. But, we're all making reasonable moves. We get castled. I have this advanced pawn in the center, which might become an advantage or might become a liability. And it's at this point that I need to recognize that this pawn is doing a good job of blunting this bishop, and I just need to... he's trying to coordinate on this pawn, but he doesn't have reasonable moves here that allow him to do that. So what I should do is just play rook e1, take advantage of the time that I have, and continue to move forward. But I trade, and eventually I lose back the pawn that I had won, and black is actually at the advantage here, mostly because of the fact that they have this dominant control of the d-file, and their queenside pawns are more advanced. I do have the advantage of having some lift for my king as opposed to my opponent, so we might have some back rank issues. But in general, the two bishops against the bishop and the knight, having better pawns lined up along the d-file, my opponent is actually winning in this position. So if we go to the next critical point of the game, we continue to play, we trade, and I'm trying to figure out what to do with my knight. I'm not entirely sure. And it is at this point that we get to this position where my opponent has actually pushed his b-pawn to make space for his bishop along this diagonal, and I'm still defending against threats along the back rank with my knight, which is good, though not double threats. And my opponent here plays rook c8, just taking advantage of the other open file. And this is the beginning of the end for him, because there's a little enough material on the board that you can't end up at a material disadvantage and still expect to do well. And so in this position, I played queen takes b4, just a free pawn, and that was, I believe, the blunder on his part. You can see I'm up 0.3, 0.4. He moves here. Now I'm up 1.3, 1.4. So good position for me. We were both getting pretty tired when we've been playing for several hours. And this was the point where I started to realize an advantage after playing through a worse middle game for super long. So it wasn't too much longer after this. My opponent continues to move. He takes control of the long diagonal. I try and figure out how to activate my knight. I want to get to here to fork his queen and his rook. He puts me in check. I'm still defending my rook. If I can find a good discovery here, then I'll win his queen. And so he does a good job of defending, and he's actually playing a mate threat here, right? So we go ahead, we play f3 to blunt his bishop, and in this position he plays rook e8. Now, the next couple of moves are pretty important. First of all, I'm going to pause for a moment and pause the video if you want to figure it out. There is an unstoppable mate threat here for white. So go ahead, white to play and win. All right, so for those of you that took the time, good, congratulations. And for those of you that didn't take the time, the move here is rook to d8. You're trying to get the rook to undefend this square, because what you want to do, for example, if your opponent takes, is just play here, and all they can do is give away all of their pieces before you give mate. You know, if they make any other move, like this is just checkmate. So mate in 6, and most of the other things that they want to do, they can't move their rook along the file because it's pinned. So if they try and, for example, defend their rook, you can take, they take, and again, you can put yourself in a position where they just don't have any space, there isn't enough material on the board, and you're going to be able to convert your advantage. However, I couldn't figure that out, and I played queen c4 check, checking and forking his king and his queen, and the only reasonable move here is for my opponent to play this, and this actually gives up most of the advantage that I have. I have about a pawn advantage, I can try and move this, but we still each have a rook and a piece on the board, and knight versus bishop in the endgame, it's debatable which one's going to be better. But my opponent did not play that. My opponent played king f8, and I took his queen, and he resigned. So that was the end of the game. We both got to the end of this really long game, and he just didn't have the stamina to keep up. So that was my second win of the tournament. And to show you the cap score, my opponent did not play super accurately, and I didn't play super accurately either, but all that really matters is that you play better than your opponent, and I did. So, a good game for me. Okay, so my first game of Sunday morning was against Bert Egley, rated about 1507, and I got to play black. Kind of unfortunate, but I got to play white twice on Saturday, so that makes some sense. And we opened in this relatively common position, a Gioco Piano game. It's a Gioco Pianissimo, and we end up in this position. And this is actually the first important move. Normally, you don't want to play f6 because it opens this diagonal to your king, but I haven't castled yet, and even if I castle, I can put a lot of things along this diagonal to sort of keep my king safe before I shuffle over. So because this gains a tempo against his bishop and allows me to continue to develop, this actually puts me at the advantage, and for the next several moves I am at the advantage. I can castle queenside, I can castle kingside, I have a lot of different possible moves. You can see the top line has me castling kingside, this line has me castling queenside, like both of them are good for me. But I head into this trade-heavy variation, and we continue to play for a while. There's a lot of sort of shuffling around. I end up with a 4-on-3 advantage on the queen side, but it's difficult to convert that into an advantage because of the fact that two of the pawns are doubled. But I step my king up, and the next important part of the game is, I believe, right here. So if we take a moment and we look at the pawns that I have, the pawns are controlling all of the possible entry points of any of his pieces in the game. And so if I just route my bishop down here to d8, then there's not a single square that the knight can go to where it can attack a pawn and combine with the king to be able to do anything. His king just has no means of walking in. And no pawn advances actually provide any advantage for him because I can always use it to create a passed pawn on the queen side. And on the king side, he just can't walk in. So if I just sit here and shuffle back and forth all day long, I'm going to win the game. But what I think to myself incorrectly is, oh, well, what if I just try and walk my king into the board? I can create a passed pawn over here. My bishop does a good job of still defending this square, and I should be able to play for an advantage. And that is not the case. The computer is saying that this is a mild advantage for white, but if you give this to a computer, it doesn't generate an advantage as far as I can tell. I'm pretty sure this is just a dead draw. But the second that I play king b6, you'll notice it shoots way up for white, from +1 to +4. And that's because this forces me to back up. Now, the question you might ask is, why don't I go here? That drops this pawn and attacks this pawn, so I would have to go back over here anyways. And as for why I don't go here, that drops this pawn with check, so then I would move over regardless. So I thought, okay, well, as long as that's going to happen, I have to just get my king over to this side. It turns out it probably would have been mildly better for me to play king c8, but that's life. Anyways, we continue to play for a long time, and the other interesting point in the game is around here. So I'm certainly losing here. You'll notice that I'm boxed in by this pawn and this knight, so my king can only really go over to b8, and he's going to try and move his pawns in. But my thought is, okay, well, I have a passed a pawn, so I can distract his king for a while, and I have these pawns over here. So I can create a pawn break. In particular, if I push here and he takes, then when I take, I can move forward. So what I should have done is waited for his king to step up one more. I end up being one tempo off, which is what finally loses me the game. But I'm already down +8 here, so I'm essentially playing for tricks. If my opponent does this properly, they're going to win. But I play h3 and try and generate a passed pawn. He has to walk his king back. I move my bishop back. I defend the queening square. I push my passed pawn. And the reason that I can't take this pawn here is that puts him in a position where he can just go ahead and queen, right? Like I'm just losing there. So I can never take his d5 pawn. So I just have to shuffle my king, and we go back and forth a bunch of times, and he eventually walks his king all the way for my passed pawn and has to sacrifice a passed pawn to get my bishop off the diagonal. He takes, and then he spends a long time sort of converting this position until eventually I have to give up my bishop, and then he's able to queen, and he doesn't stalemate me, and he wins the game. So it was a 103 move game, but since move 40 or so, he was definitely winning. But an interesting game nonetheless, a long strategic battle, and if I had just on move 38, if I just sat here and chilled, it would have been a draw. And I knew that, and I tried to play for an advantage, and I should have slowed down and spent more time calculating to make sure that I wasn't incorrect. Anyways, an interesting game. And before I forget, here's the cap score. So you can see both of us actually played pretty well. My opponent played 87.5, which makes sense. I mean, this set of pawns over here isn't going to do much, and they actually have a reasonable majority over here. But I played pretty well as well, 81.2. You know, I blundered a few times, but for the most part, that was already happening at the point where I was definitely losing, and there was just one critical error where I played king b6 here to lose the game. So an interesting game. All right, so for the last game, I played against Jeremy Callis, and I wish that I could not include this video in the recap, but I'm an honest man. I was just totally out of juice. I wasn't playing very well, and so we're going to watch me just totally fall apart here. So the first interesting move in this game, actually, is he plays queen b6, and so he's lining up here, and he's lining up here. And I can't move my bishop because it undefends this pawn. You know, pushing this pawn removes some of the defense from this pawn. It's difficult. It's going to open up. This isn't a huge threat, but it requires white to respond accurately. I played queen b3, which isn't a terrible move. It gives black a very, very mild advantage. But my opponent said this is what took him out of book, which I felt pretty good about, because at this point, you know, we're playing a pretty even game. My opponent knows what's going on. I don't. I'm okay with that. Anyways, we continue to play, and it's when we get to this point, there are a lot of interesting potential tactics here, but it's when we get to this point. This is the first interesting point in the game. Now, the question is, I'm attacking this 3 times. Can I take this? And my first thought was, no, I can't take it, because if I go, his rook comes and pins me. And my second thought was, well, I have all these defenders. Like, it should be okay, right? Because how is he going to attack it another time? And just from being tired, I noted that he would have 2 attackers and I would have 2 defenders, but it didn't occur to me how difficult it would be to get a third defender into the play. So I went ahead and took the pawn. I was thinking, no, you need to be sure of yourself. If you think that you're winning a pawn, go ahead and win the pawn. Totally wrong. I'm losing a bishop here. He plays here, and I go, yes, I'm losing. So then I thought, okay, well, how do I lose as reasonable? Like, how do I take this losing position and play as reasonably as possible? And what I should have probably done is just play something like queen c2, queen b2, you know, defend the rook. For example, if he plays here, now he's in a pin, and if he takes with the rook, then we just trade, and I just go, I'm down a piece. I've been down a piece before. Like, we'll figure it out. I'll find a way to push my queen side. Maybe he'll have a hard time sort of dealing with the central pressure. And that would have been okay. Would have been better than what I did. But I thought, okay, well, as long as I'm going to be losing that bishop, I might as well get more pieces into the game. So I play bishop b5 with the intention that when he takes, I want to play bishop a4, thinking, aha, now I've got this good bishop. It's hard for him to move his knight. I can threaten to trade bishops, and because that'll come with check, potentially I can win the rook. And I totally missed the follow-up, and at this point I was already emotionally devastated, and that's where my opponents play b5, which is just to attack the bishop. I can't move it because I lose my queen, right? So now I've gone from losing 1 piece to losing 2 pieces. So I say, okay, well, let's try and generate some counterplay here, right? Maybe he takes, I can take, we can make the game a little bit chaotic. But my opponent continues to play properly, and it was after this point, I mean, I'm basically losing, and I think, okay, well, I can at least move my queen to b2. And my opponent plays queen e5, which now loses this rook, right? So I play something like this to defend. My opponent takes, and then if I take, now I'm down a queen and a couple of pieces. I'm minus 20 at this point, just ridiculous. So when we got to this point, I was just like, okay, I'm down 2 pieces, and I'm losing a rook. I'm resourceful, but I'm not that resourceful. I can force my opponent to just sit here and force me to do it. But it was the last game of the tournament, and I was ready to go home. So I went ahead and called it quits. And if we look at the cap score, we can see my opponent knew what they were doing, 95.4. I mean, admittedly, they just played the tactics available to them, not particularly difficult. But I did a good job out of the opening until I got to the point that I blundered. Like, I went from a position which was slightly worse to a position which was slightly better. But the computer says, man, you can't just give away all your pieces. It gives me a 24.7, which, hey, fair. It just wasn't a good game on my part. Anyways, I hope that was a fun recap for you guys. The chess was really difficult, but it was very fun. As I'd mentioned in the recap video, I finally got a provisional rating. This time it's actually 1341. They adjusted the scores a little bit because some people went up, so I gained 1 rating point. Huzzah. And I'm looking for more over-the-board chess tournaments to play. If anybody knows of anything in California that they can recommend in the next couple of months, I'm all ears. Let me know. Anyways, have a great day, guys.